Our mission statement at the church: we exist to glorify God by pointing the affections of all peoples to the all-satisfying person of Jesus Christ. And when you hear that, peoples, that plural, at first you might think it's a mistake, but it's actually pointing to the ethnic groups of the world. We're not just, the gospel isn't just for America, it's for all tribes, tongues, nations. So we always want to be about the work of missions. And of course, our church is just a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of this gigantic task, but I wanted to give you an update today about a few things. First, as many of you know, we support a pastor-teacher named Tia in India, and I had a chance to go there last year and visit the ministry over there, and just affirmed and reaffirmed that this is something we need to be continuing to support. We became aware of some needs for scholarships, and so we wanted to just share those with you because I think it's encouraging to see kind of what's going on and where the missions dollars of this church are going. So there were 4 students that we were able to help. Let's see, I think I got the wrong set of slides. Can you refresh that for me? Just a refresh there. There we go. Okay, so four students we were able to support this year. 3 of them are from the north of India, in a state called, or in the state of Nagaland, and they're coming from really poor families, poor farmers, a poor taxi driver, and they want to go and share the gospel when they get done. Some of them want to go to the Middle East and minister to Middle Eastern countries. Another is from Myanmar, and he's the first from his village to study theology, and so he wants to go back to his village and do church planting work in his area in Myanmar. So for $800, we were able to support 4 students for a year, room, board, and tuition. So, I mean, this is money that's so easy to justify, so well spent, pretty awesome. Be praying for these guys. I met 3 of these 4 while I was there, and they are just awesome young men who want to give their lives to the Lord. So pray for them and pray for the others this year as well. Also want to give you an update on Tom Manning. Tom spoke here this summer. If you remember, he's the missionary from Jordan. And he was traveling back to Jordan, had plans to go back to Jordan, and got stopped and detained at the border, and his visa yanked. And so he was not able to go back. His wife had the same thing happen to him. So neither of them can go back ever. They've been blacklisted. And so they weren't able to go pack up their homes, say goodbye to their friends. They've just been rejected from going back to the country. So they're having to think through, what's the next step for us? What do we do? What does God want us to do? So pray for them as well. Now let's just take a moment as a group to do that, pray for these 2 ministries. Father, we just recognize you as sovereign over the entire world, and this whole job of reaching all nations is impossible. We just simply can't do it, and it's not our business to orchestrate it from a big picture. And Lord, whether you are sending people from India to other nations or whether you are removing one of our missionaries from Jordan, Lord, you have a big plan, and we just want to entrust the people that we love and care for into your hands and pray that you encourage them and direct them in your timing. And so, Lord, just be constantly changing us into your image so that we can be effective users, effective gospel witnesses for you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, well, if you have your Bibles, open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and today we get to talk about one of my absolutely favorite gospel concepts. This idea that kingdom power is to be found through weakness, and that kingdom wisdom is to be found through foolishness. So if you want to be wise and powerful in God's economy, you've got to be a weak fool in the eyes of the world. Now, why in the world would this be one of my favorite gospel concepts? Just for the record, I have no desire to be called a weak fool. This has not been on my bucket list. Matter of fact, for my personality, this is be one of the worst insults you could call me, is a weak fool. I like to be strong and I like to be smart. So why would this be one of my favorite concepts? The reason is because it points to the true form of it. It should not surprise us at all that someone who's unfamiliar, those things that people are most unfamiliar with are oftentimes the things that they scorn, right? And so it shouldn't surprise us that this is the case, but it should interest us. So what is true gospel wisdom? What is true gospel power, and how do you get it? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, this particular explanation of power through weakness is very directly connected to what Nate talked about last week. Last week, Nate talked about the danger of divisions that's caused through personality cults. And this is the first of many problems that Paul is going to address in the Corinthian church. And we've seen this particular manifestation undoubtedly in your life. Someone who loves a particular preacher or a particular teacher, and they get enamored with them in some way, and then they all of a sudden become the source of truth rather than God himself, and it tends to create divisions in the church. And so when Paul launches into this section on foolishness and wisdom, power and weakness, he's actually addressing that issue, okay? He's going to argue the reason you're attracted to one man's wisdom over another is you don't understand true wisdom. You don't understand the source of wisdom. You love worldly wisdom and worldly power. Personality cults arise when we worship human wisdom and we worship human power. And Paul's going to direct us away from that. He's going to sour us on human wisdom. And he's going to point us to the source of all wisdom, which is God himself. And so he's going to go off on this for a little while. And the reason I want to point that out to you is that it's easy to kind of lose track of the big picture and the structure of what's going on. So I'll show you this to you, not that you can actually read it here, but look at the blocks of text. Okay, first of all, the first circle there is where Nate talked about last week. Okay, not Paul, Paulus. Then he goes off in this long section on wisdom, and then he's going to conclude with Paul, Paulus again. Okay, so I'm just trying to show you the big picture here. What's he doing? So when we finally get to chapter 3, verse 21, he's going to close it off like this. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. So that's the structure. That's what he's doing. Let's examine why Paul is so concerned with this idea that we get enamored by human wisdom and not God's wisdom, human strength and not God's strength. So let's pick up the words in verse 17, chapter 1, verse 17. So last week we learned that the Corinthians were acquiring this kind of twisted identity based on who it was that baptized them. And Paul summarizes this Christian celebrity business in verse 17. He says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." So we learn from this verse that when you're in the business of following men, the main problem is that you're looking to human power. Much of the controversy in Corinth was probably stirred up by this desire of the Corinthians to want to have their own philosopher, to want to have their guy who could compete with the other philosophers of the day. And so they're saying, hey, we've got our own guy that can do a really good job, that can philosophize in cool ways. And Paul wants to take the focus off of men and put the focus on the message. He says, you're being enamored by a human's ability to articulate or to captivate or to entertain in some way, right? You're being enamored by that, but don't you realize that when you do that, you empty the power of the cross? The Christians here would object to Paul. They'd say, no, Paul, what do you mean? What do you mean the cross is empty of the power? Can't you look at the church in Corinth? It's exploding. Look at all the people. It's the murmur of the town. Look at how much glory God is getting through that. It's the talk of everyone. And what does Paul say here? He says, have you actually listened to what they've said? Because I have. When someone comes to them excited saying, look at the church in Corinth, unbeliever, look at it, look how much it's growing. What do they say? They yawn. Like, that's nothing. That's nothing. That's just a bag of tricks and gimmicks. Right? You act like this is a miracle of some sort, that this church is growing, but I can explain to you exactly why people go to Paul's church or Apollos' church or whatever, right? Good looking, eloquent. Right? He's got a unique personality, super definitive, They got coffee in the lobby. They got a play area for the kids. They got good sound system, good screens, good graphics. Got a bestseller that scratches all the itches. Right? There's no mystery why that place is thriving. We don't need a supernatural explanation. A human explanation works just fine. You see what Paul's saying? He says they've got to use words to communicate the gospel. I have to do it. But I don't need word tricks. I don't need gimmicks. I don't need to wow people. The power is not in the stunning delivery of the message. The power is in the message itself. And let me give you an example of what Paul means here. Take, someone's mom. Maybe this person, maybe your mom, maybe she's uneducated. Maybe she grew up, never really had a formal education, is terrible with words. Hanging participles at the end of their sentences, whatever. I think I just did that. She might have a very unimaginative vocabulary, very plain. And with those words, those very plain words, she can communicate her love to you. Right? And that, because it's pointing to the reality, the truth, that will have an effect on you. That will change you. Not because they were eloquent, but because they were true, right? Conversely, another person might be able to stand up in front of 5,000 people and just wow them with a speech on love. And it is eloquent, it is amazing, but it ends there. That person doesn't love you, and therefore it won't change you. The power ends in just the eloquence itself, and then it ends. There's no reality that it points to. Being enamored at the cleverness of the articulation will just end at the cleverness of the articulation. There's nothing greater than just the articulation. But if the words point to something greater, then the words are simply tools, right? They just point beyond. It could be a cardboard sign that points, it could be a flashing neon sign that points, but it's pointing to something bigger. I'm just trying to get to the actual substance that those words represent, and that substance will change you. Whether it's coming from Paul or Apollos or Cephas, whether it's simple, complex, articulate, amazing, simple, it doesn't matter as long as it's pointing to the substance. So what Paul's going to do here is help invert our understanding of true power and true wisdom and to go beyond the human conduit to the source itself. So let's read the text starting in verse 18. So Paul says this, one more thing. So for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made the wisdom of foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, right? A stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So we're going to use this passage as a way to look at the nature of true gospel power and true gospel wisdom. And here's kind of a summary. If you want to summarize that whole thing, it's this. Gospel power is the emptying of worldly power to make room for God's power. And gospel wisdom is the emptying of human wisdom to make room for God's wisdom. And clearly this is the theme. If you were just kind of big picture, look at this text. I just kind of underlined all the words that wisdom and folly, wisdom and folly, wisdom and folly, wisdom and folly, weakness, foolishness. Weakness, power, weakness, power, weakness, power. It's the theme, clearly the theme of this passage. And what's important to emphasize here is the mutually exclusive nature of God's wisdom and man's wisdom. In the material world, you have like a coin that you flip, right? This is a mutually exclusive device. You can't flip the coin and go, oh, would you look at that? I got heads and tails, right? It doesn't ever work that way. By having one, the other is removed. And so it is with wisdom and power. If you want God's power, you have to empty yourself of your own. And if you want God's wisdom, you have to empty yourself of your own. And this is a little bit of a pride puncturer. We always want to say, well, can't I add a little bit of my own wisdom? And God says, well, sure, add it anytime you want. But the second you do that, you remove my wisdom. Right? That's the idea. Now let's talk for a moment in specifics about what that means. What does it mean to empty yourself of worldly wisdom. Because this is the path, right? If we want God's wisdom, we have to empty ourselves of worldly wisdom. What does that mean? Well, in verse 26, we'll get to that soon. Paul says, "Not many of you were powerful or wise by worldly standards." What's the standard that the world sets up for wisdom? I mean, we could articulate this. There's probably lots of paths, but you could articulate one for sure. If you want to be wise in the world's eyes, well, you've got to go to the right school, right? You've got to graduate with the right test scores, ACT test scores, SAT. It'd be great if you aced those. Graduate top of your class, summa cum laude, right? The Latin helps a little bit. And because you graduate top of the class, you get to go to some Ivy League school. That'd be great. Put that on your resume. But be careful not to specialize too early, right? You want to spread things out, maybe get a double major in something different than you're actually going to go to. Then maybe spend some time overseas, grab a language or two while you're overseas, get some international experience, right? Then you then begin to specialize. Then you go to the PhD world, get your master's degree, but not from the same educational institution. Again, you want to spread out a little bit. Then you're going to get some vocational experience, learn from the experts, begin writing some journal articles, get some good peer review, right? That'll be the fodder for your best-selling book that comes out. You'll have to be well-connected in the social media world in order for that to be well-received, right? Get lots of followers on Twitter and Facebook. And then the pinnacle of this wisdom would be you break through in some area. Some undiscovered field, you make a new discovery, and we'll give you a Nobel Peace Prize, and we'll call you wise. Right? That's the world's standard for wisdom. And Paul says, where is the one who is wise? Right? In other words, where's the PhDs of the world? Where are the scribes? In other words, where are the published authors? Where are the debaters of this age, the political pundits, the Larry Kings of the world? Where are these guys? This is what the world calls wise and powerful, and Paul says God has something way better than this. Way better than this. Something that's so amazing that if you were to compare it, it would actually make that wisdom look like foolishness. And you say to yourself, well, great, man, is there a better path, a quicker path, something that's even more amazing than these guys who are wisdom superstars? And Paul says, here it is. There's a one-step process. Preach Christ crucified. Preach, as he says there, the word of the cross. You're thinking, what? How exactly is that wisdom? And the world is not going to agree with this. That's why these are mutually exclusive concepts. From the perspective of the cross, the wisdom of the world looks like foolishness. From the perspective of the world, the wisdom of the cross looks like foolishnness. And that word foolishness is actually built on the Greek word that we get our English word moron from, right? So that's how the people, really? You think the cross is wisdom? You're a moron. How could you possibly think that? And even in this text, you see the pushback from the people in Paul's day. The Jews, what did they want? They wanted a sign. They wanted someone like Moses or Elijah to demonstrate they are from God. Where are the Jews? They're under captivity. They're under oppression from Rome, and they've been that way for 400 years. I mean, they want a deliverer. Give me a sign to show that this guy's from God, right? That he can deliver us from the power of our oppressors. To suggest that the Messiah would die in weakness, I mean, this is a stumbling block. That's, the Greek word there is scandalon. We get our word scandalous from that word. What's a scandal? A scandal is something regarded as wrong and then causes an outrage, right? To suggest that the Messiah would die in weakness on a cross of an instrument of torture and shame, to suggest the Messiah is going to die like that, that's an outrage. How dare you? Right? The Greeks, on the other hand, wanted wisdom. They wanted someone who could compete at the highest levels of philosophical debate and push their opponents into the corner. They wanted something that was both intellectually interesting and also something that was aesthetically pleasing. And unfortunately, the cross is neither. It's neither of those. Right? It's something that can be communicated by a child in 5 minutes, and then it's over. And then you just have to deal with the implications of it for the rest of your life. Paul's trying to communicate that true wisdom and true power is found in what appears to be foolish. Now let's look at why. Why is there wisdom in the cross? Number one, the wisdom of the cross creates intellectual life. And Paul tells us in this passage what distinguishes in the most ultimate sense between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom is this idea of life, of intellectual life. Now, if you ask somebody, maybe in the world or just someone who doesn't believe in God, what's the path to kind of answering the questions of life? What's going to give you intellectual satisfaction? What's true wisdom? Right? Where are they going to point to? Most likely, many people anyway, will say science. Science is the path. Science will give us the answers. Science is the path to true wisdom, to true life. But let me apply Proverbs 16:25 to this. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And I'll just say that it does seem, doesn't it? Like science will give us the answers that we need. I mean, those guys out there, right? They keep on discovering them, whoever they are, right? They just keep on discovering cool things. And I love science more than anybody. I love science. Right? Every day it's answering more and more questions. Every day it's unlocking the mysteries of life. Science must be it. But you have to realize, what are the limits of science? Paul says, the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. What does it mean to thwart someone or to thwart something? If a criminal has an eye on the safe inside your mansion, right? What does it mean to thwart him? Well, it means that before he even tries, you take all the money out of the safe. So no matter how smart he is, no matter how cunning he is, no matter how elaborate his plan is to get by the guards, to get into snip the security cameras, to get into the safe, to unlock it, it's thwarted from the get-go, right? There's no treasure in there. You've taken it all out. That's what it means to thwart. And God says, oh, wise man, your plans have been thwarted, right? I've set up the whole game so that no matter how much you try, no matter how hard you discover, no matter how many scientific studies you've performed, you'll never discover the answer to the question that you were made to want to know. You'll never find it out. It can't be done. There's no power great enough, no mind smart enough. I set it up that way on purpose from the beginning. It's not discoverable through the scientific method, period. Think about it. Can the wisdom of the world ever answer the most meaningful questions that you long to know? What were you made for? What is the purpose of life? Let's say science runs its course all the way out to the completion. Every single mystery of the universe has been uncovered. There's no riddles left. Science has answered every single one of them. What can science ever tell you about what's right or wrong? Right? What can a microscope tell you about that? A telescope? Nothing. And yet that's all we care about. The news is filled with whether something was right or wrong. Can science tell you whether something is beautiful? Can science tell you what experiment could you run to talk about the value of life? What experiment could you run to talk about what it means to be truly human? Science can tell you how to recombine DNA to make a new thing, even, a new bacterium or maybe genetically altered fruit. But should you do that? Science can't answer that question. For almost any important scientific advance, one could imagine a positive and a negative, but what's the answer? Should we do it or not? Science helps us describe how the world is, but then somehow we have to decide how to use that knowledge. You see the problem of worldly wisdom? Who cares? Let's say you know everything. Then what? What's the point? What's the purpose? What did I do with all that knowledge? What did I do with all that information? Where does it lead? What does it profit a man? Right? If he wins the Nobel Prize, gets a PhD, understands all the science mysteries in the world, but forfeits his soul. See, real wisdom is the path that produces intellectual life, and science is not it. Many will hear this as justification to condemn those who have influence, maybe, or those who have money, or those who have had a wonderful education, or those who who are influential in the world. And Jesus is not saying, don't hear it this way, Jesus is not saying, don't put your kids in school. Don't learn anything about science. Don't try. Don't get good SAT scores, and don't, whatever. I don't know. Just don't do anything. Don't excel. All you need to do is focus on the cross. No. Focusing on the cross will help you to excel in all those areas, but for a different reason, right? You love science because it points to the glory of God. You love learning because it's an opportunity to influence the world for Christ. You love whatever you love because of those reasons, not because you want it to point to yourself. So the wisdom of the cross creates intellectual life. Secondly, the wisdom of the cross creates social peace. So not only does the cross fix the intellectual problem, it fixes the heart problem. It fixes the social problem. It doesn't just provide a framework for understanding, the sciences and why we learn and why we study and all these kinds of things. It does do that, but it goes beyond that. It transforms the person by giving you a point, a purpose, right? When the purpose problem is solved, all of a sudden the social problems follow. I want to get really practical here. How does the cross fix us as humans? We all admit that we're broken people. We all admit that. Even the most adamant atheists would agree with you on this point. The world is messed up, no question. But how does the cross fix that? Show me how power through weakness works. I don't really understand that. Show me how there's wisdom through folly. How does that really change people and transform people? Well, think of it this way. Remember Jesus' words in Mark 8:35? He says this, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." And what is Jesus saying here? He's saying our default is to try to be wise and powerful on our own. That's our default. Instead, we need to surrender our power and serve other people. And in that weakness, right, that in that being weak and being a servant, we end up changing the world, changing ourselves and changing the world, right? Being a servant and being weak are almost exact synonyms in the Bible. It's really interesting. If you ever go through the Bible and interchange those words, weakness and servant, you'll see they're almost direct synonyms. The way you change the world is by serving it. How can we serve others? How can we give ourselves away over and over and over again? What is the weakness that the Bible talks about? I think this is the core of it, serving other people. The world says, how can you get the most money? The gospel says, how can you give the most away? The world says, how can you orchestrate this situation so that at the end of your life, you have the most amount of time for yourself? I can do all the things I want to do, all the hobbies I want to do, all the things I want to do, everything for myself. And the gospel says, no. How can you orchestrate your life so you can give yourself away in the most radical possible way? The guy who wins in the end is the guy who gives away the most. And the world would say, that's just weakness. What are you talking about? How do we give ourselves away, our emotional energy, our mental energy, our creative energy? How do we give ourselves away? How do we become servants of all? Look at Jesus' words here in Mark 10. But it shall not be so among you. He's talking about the rulers of the world lord it over one another. They're trying to always get in that first place of preeminence. Jesus says, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's easy to hear the word weakness and misunderstand what's meant by that, right? Jesus was very powerful, right? In all senses, he was very powerful, but his power was often perceived as weakness. Jesus was the greatest servant that ever lived, which means he was also the most powerful person that ever lived. Because what's easier to do, be selfish or be selfless? What's easier? Of course it's easier to be selfless. Well, it takes more strength, more power to be a selfless person, to surrender yourself. And Jesus was such a servant that he gave up his life, surrendered his life, served unto death. Man. I mean, do you want to do that? Would you want to suffer in this way? Do you have the strength to suffer for other people in that way? Do you see the power of weakness there? His enemies looked at him and assumed he was trapped. They said, hey, he saved other people, but he can't even save himself. Look at the weak guy hanging on the cross. And can you imagine the strength it would take to hear those words, to know that you could open up heaven and angels could come pouring down to vindicate your claims, the power needed to stay on that cross and die for the very people who are mocking you? You see that strength? Do you perceive in Jesus this true strength that the world calls weakness? This is the wisdom that the world calls foolishness. And Jesus asks us to do the exact same thing. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Right? Let him become weak. Let him become a fool. Deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Do you see this? It is a choice that you make. Who am I going to live for? Who will I die for? Right? It's God or me. It's worldly wisdom or God's wisdom. Worldly power or God's power. Imagine if you served your family this week in that way. Imagine it. What would that unleash? Imagine if you served your neighbors in that way. What kind of power and influence would that have? What if you gave up all pretenses of trying to get ahead, trying to be smarter than the next guy, trying to do it better than the next guy, and you just served your guts out? You just embraced the title of a fool, and you just lived like this. What would that do? Have you ever thought in those terms? Have you ever even tried it? A 19th century author once wrote, he said, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. Now, this is true. We can hardly conceive of a world in which we live and serve other people the way Jesus served us, of emptying ourselves so that the true gospel power and gospel wisdom can flow through us. Let's ask God right now to help us with that, to ask God to empty us of our plans and ambitions and our maybe even our own dreams of what we think our life ought to be like and our own idea of what power is, and then ask him to change us so that his power can become part of us. Father in heaven, I ask you to just, first of all, make us aware of those areas in our life where we are running after worldly power and worldly wisdom, and where we want to be loved by the world, we want to be esteemed by the world, we want the world to say, wow, he's really smart, or she's really smart, or she's really powerful. I pray that you would help us to not be enamored by that, to not want that in any way. But Lord, instead to just be signposts to you, that whether we're eloquent and educated, which is a good thing, or whether we are poor and uneducated, which is also a good thing, that we both become, wherever we find ourselves, that we point to you, this source of power, the source of true wisdom, and that we would not strip the cross of its power by trying to do it through worldly ways. And there's all these temptations along the way to try to trust in human means, and I pray that you would just strip us of that, Lord. Bring us back down to the basics of just preaching Christ and him crucified. We want to love that reality, that you died on a cross and saved us from our sins. That's just a simple sentence that doesn't need a lot of glamour or explanation to it. It's just a simple sentence that you died to save us from our sins. And we want to love that, and we want to worship you for it. In your name.